The first time she said it, I thought I'd misheard her. "You don't need more pills," Dr. Hayes said softly. "You need to start listening to yourself." Her voice was calm, certain, like someone diagnosing not a symptom but a soul. I remember staring at her office window, watching the rain draw silver streaks down the glass, trying to avoid her eyes. I'd come in for something simple, insomnia, maybe stress. I was 23, overworked, living on caffeine and quiet panic. I wanted a prescription, something to numb the noise inside me. Instead, she gave me that look, the kind that saw straight through pretense. "You're tired," she said, folding her hands. But not the kind of tired medication fixes. I forced a smile. "I'm fine." "Really?" She tilted her head, that clinical kind of kindness never leaving her eyes. "Are you?" There was something about her tone, neither pity nor judgment, just presence, that made my throat tighten. For a second I almost said it, the thing I hadn't said to anyone, the thought that had followed me like a whisper since childhood. Instead, I laughed awkwardly. "I just need something to sleep." She nodded slowly, wrote something down on her notepad, then tore the paper carefully and handed it to me. "Then take this." I glanced at it, expecting the name of some sedative, but there was no drug listed. Just a single word, written neatly in looping ink. Reflection. I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She smiled. "Come back in a week. Tell me what you see." When I left her office, the air outside felt heavier, like the city was pressing closer. The word lingered in my mind as I rode the bus home. Reflection. It sounded like a riddle, or maybe a dare. That night, I sat in front of the mirror in my apartment, half out of boredom, half out of confusion. My face looked tired, my jaw too sharp, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. I leaned closer, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw something shift behind my own reflection, a softness, a warmth, a version of myself that wasn't exactly me, but wasn't a stranger either. I blinked, and it was gone. But the next morning, when I went to wash my face, I hesitated. My hand lingered on the mirror again. And the strangest thought came, uninvited but clear as breath. What if this isn't the body I was meant to heal? The paper with the single word lay on my desk for days. At first, I treated it like a joke, a quirk from a doctor who read too much poetry. But the longer it sat there, the harder it was to ignore. Reflection. No dosage, no directions, no refill. Just that single word looping in her steady handwriting, as if she had written a secret she knew I wasn't ready to say aloud. By the third night, I couldn't sleep again. The city outside was quiet, the kind of 2 a.m. silence that hums beneath the walls. I found myself back in front of the mirror, the apartment lit only by my computer screen. I looked at my face until the lines blurred. My eyes looked heavy, but something about them felt watchful, like there was someone else behind them, waiting patiently for me to notice. Reflection. I whispered, testing the sound. It felt strange in my mouth, half prayer, half question. The next morning I returned to Dr. Hayes' office even though my appointment wasn't scheduled for another few days. She didn't seem surprised. "Couldn't wait a week?" she asked with a faint smile. "I don't understand what you meant," I said. "I've been doing what you said, staring into mirrors like a lunatic. Nothing's changing." She leaned back in her chair, calm as ever. "That's not what I asked you to do. I asked you to listen to yourself. Reflection isn't about staring, it's about noticing what speaks when everything else is quiet." I blinked. "So, this is some kind of mindfulness exercise?" She tilted her head. "Call it what you like. Just keep doing it." Then, after a pause, she added softly, "And maybe ask yourself who you expect to see when you look." I didn't answer because the truth was I didn't know. Over the next week, something subtle began to shift. It started with the clothes I wore. I'd never thought much about them before. Jeans, loose shirts, things that didn't attract attention. But suddenly textures mattered. I found myself drawn to softer fabrics, lighter colors, as if my body was quietly rejecting the weight of everything rough and practical. At work, I caught my reflection in the elevator's chrome panel, shoulders slightly rounded, expression gentler than I remembered. It startled me enough that I stepped back. But when the doors opened, no one else seemed to notice anything. It was all happening in the space between perception and feeling, invisible but undeniable. That night, I tried something different. Instead of staring into the mirror, I talked. I told it about my day, about how strange it felt to want things I couldn't name, about how scared I was of whatever was waking up inside me. My reflection didn't answer, but it listened. For the first time, I realized that listening was the point. A few days later, I met Dr. Hayes again. "You look rested," she said. "I'm not," I replied honestly. "I'm confused." She smiled. "Good. Confusion is a sign of movement." "Movement toward what?" Her eyes softened. "Toward yourself." When I left her office this time, she didn't give me paper. Only a small mirror, the kind that fits in a pocket. "Keep it with you," she said. "Look when you need to remember that change doesn't ask for permission." I didn't understand then what she meant, but that night, when the city lights hit the tiny mirror surface, I saw something that made me catch my breath. My face again, yes, but also a trace of warmth, a quiet grace that had never been there before. And in that moment, I realized what she had prescribed wasn't medicine at all. It was permission to see, to wonder, to let go. I woke the next morning before my alarm, the room still dim with that gray-blue light that arrives before sunrise. For a moment, I couldn't tell what had roused me, some sound, a dream, or the echo of something Dr. Hayes had said echoing through my half-sleep. "It isn't a pill, it's a perspective." I lay there repeating it, the phrase rolling over itself like a mantra, and I noticed that my chest felt light, my breath softer somehow, as if a layer of static had been turned down in the background of my mind. When I finally got up, the mirror above the dresser caught me again, an old habit I'd never had much reason to break. I'd always seen the same neutral expression looking back, but this morning something about it was looser. The corners of my mouth rested differently, not a smile, but the suggestion of one. The simplest movement, lifting a shirt from the chair, combing through my hair, carried a new rhythm, measured but unforced. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination stretching. But later that day, at the office, small things started to surface. At the coffee machine, Jordan from marketing, who never usually noticed me, said, "You seem lighter today. Did something good happen?" I almost laughed. Lighter? I had no idea how to explain that something invisible had shifted inside me. I shrugged and said, "Maybe I just slept well." He nodded and smiled back longer than expected, as if trying to identify the difference he couldn't name. Throughout the day, I caught reflections in windows and computer screens, and each one felt like a conversation between two versions of myself. My posture was straighter, my gestures more open. A few coworkers looked twice when I spoke, not out of confusion but curiosity, like they were sensing a frequency they hadn't noticed before. When I left the office that evening, the city felt new again. I walked slower, watching the wind tug at loose strands of my hair, listening to the soft rhythm of my shoes against the pavement. I passed a clothing boutique and stopped without meaning to. In the glass, the mannequins stood in pale dresses that swayed just slightly in the air conditioning, and for a moment I felt something tug gently at my chest. Not envy exactly, but recognition, like remembering a language I used to speak in a dream. I didn't go inside. I just stood there long enough for the shop assistant to glance my way and smile. That smile was kind, and I carried it with me for the rest of the walk home. That night, when I undressed, I noticed how my hands lingered differently on my reflection. No judgment this time, just quiet study. I thought of Dr. Hayes again, and how calm she'd been when she'd said, "It's about listening to the version of yourself you've been silencing." I whispered the words aloud, half embarrassed but comforted by the sound of them. Over the next few days, little things changed in ways no one else could measure but me. I started picking out softer colors when I dressed, not because I meant to, but because they felt closer to how I felt inside, gentle, reflective, alive. My voice carried new inflections, not higher, but warmer, more deliberate. The mirror had become less of a test and more of a companion. Even my routines felt rewritten. Mornings weren't rushed. They were rituals. Coffee, window light, one quiet moment to breathe and feel the small pulse of gratitude that I was beginning, finally, to meet myself halfway. And somewhere in the background, I still felt that quiet hum of mystery, the sense that Dr. Hayes's prescription wasn't a metaphor at all, but some subtle shift in the chemistry of how I inhabited the world. By the end of that week, people smiled at me more. Doors opened. Conversations lingered. It wasn't about beauty or style. It was about something in my presence that invited softness. For the first time in my life, that softness didn't frighten me. It felt earned. When I caught my reflection one evening, the fading sunlight poured across my face and I saw it. Something unmistakable. Not transformation in the physical sense, but alignment, as though the outside had finally caught up to the inside. I pressed my fingertips to the glass, smiled faintly, and whispered, "So this is what she meant." For the first time in years, silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. Every night I would sit by the window with the lamp turned low, watching the city hum below, and the quiet between the sounds seemed to speak back to me. I started noticing things that had always been there but hidden beneath the noise. The faint perfume of rain through an open window, the soft sigh that escaped my throat when a certain song came on, the way light curved over my hands when I held them up. I'd thought transformation meant change. What I hadn't expected was recognition. It wasn't that I was becoming someone new. It was that I was finally brave enough to look at who had been waiting. The small notebook Dr. Hayes had given me sat on the nightstand. "Record how you feel," she'd said, "not what you do." At first the pages filled with single words, confused, lighter, strange. But now the entries were longer, like small letters to the self I kept meeting in the mirror. I wrote, "There's a calm now. Not happiness, not yet. But I think I'm beginning to trust the person inside the reflection." Some evenings, I would catch myself rehearsing conversations in my head, not with anyone else, but with the version of me I used to hide. I would apologize for years of silence, for treating her voice as a problem to solve. It sounds odd, talking to yourself like that, but each imagined reply felt like forgiveness. Dr. Hayes called one afternoon, just as I'd finished writing. "I wanted to see how the prescription is working," she said. Her voice carried that gentle smile I remembered from her office. "I think it's working differently than I expected," I told her. "How so?" "I don't feel fixed. I feel seen. By myself." There was a long pause, then she said softly, "Good. Seeing yourself clearly is the first step toward deciding how you want the world to see you." That sentence stayed with me. It looped in my mind through the following days, shaping how I moved, how I spoke. The mirror had stopped being a battlefield. It had become a dialogue. Each morning I would look, nod, and whisper something kind. Not praise, just permission to exist. The world outside began to mirror that internal kindness. Neighbors who barely noticed me before now greeted me. A barista remembered my name. Even the way sunlight fell through the office blinds seemed to soften the edges of everything. One night, as I stood brushing my hair before bed, I realized that my reflection no longer startled me. There was a grace in my stance, a quiet certainty. Not perfection, just presence. I smiled at her, the version of me I used to avoid, and said aloud, "We made it through the noise." The next week felt like breathing after years of holding air in. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand revelations. Yet every ordinary moment carried a softness that made it feel new. I started walking to work instead of taking the bus. The city's morning rhythm, the sound of heels clicking on pavement, the murmur of cafes opening, the shimmer of shop windows catching first light, wrapped around me like a gentle soundtrack. Each reflection I passed added a stroke to the self-portrait I was slowly painting without realizing it. In the office elevator, my own posture surprised me. Straight but relaxed, eyes lifted. When a colleague complimented my new glasses, I caught myself smiling without shrinking. "Thanks," I said simply, and it felt like the first honest word I'd spoken all morning. By lunchtime, I found myself sitting with a few coworkers I used to avoid. Conversation drifted easily. Music, weekend plans, a funny story about someone's dog. Their laughter felt warm, And when I joined in, it didn't sound forced anymore. It sounded real. That evening, I stopped by the boutique I'd once only dared to stare into through glass. The mannequins were the same, still wrapped in soft colors and light fabric. I almost turned away again, but then I remembered what Dr. Hayes had said. Seeing yourself clearly is the first step toward deciding how you want the world to see you. I stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, and for a moment I froze, expecting judgment. None came. The clerk smiled, asked if I needed help, and when I hesitated, she said, "Take your time." I wandered through the racks, running my fingers lightly over fabric, not because I was shopping, but because I wanted to feel texture, possibility. Every shade of pastel felt like a question whispered softly. Is this closer to who you are? When I finally left, I hadn't bought anything, but I didn't need to. The act of walking in had already changed something. That night, I wrote in my notebook again. I don't think becoming yourself is about changing everything. Maybe it's about letting the quiet parts of you speak louder. The next morning, I dressed deliberately, not for attention but for alignment, soft shirt, comfortable jeans, sneakers. When I caught my reflection before leaving, the look wasn't about blending in or standing out. It was about being honest. At work, Jordan noticed. "You look good today," he said, then quickly added, "Not that you didn't before, I just mean you seem comfortable." "I am," I replied, and for the first time it was true. Walking home that evening, a light drizzle began to fall. I didn't rush. I let the rain soak gently into my sleeves, cool and grounding. Every drop felt like punctuation in a story still being written. By the time I reached my apartment, twilight had folded over the city. I looked up, saw my reflection in the window again, blurred by rain but still unmistakably me, and whispered, "Thank you, Dr. Hayes." It was a Sunday afternoon when I found myself walking toward Dr. Hayes's clinic again. I hadn't made an appointment. I just felt the pull of that quiet waiting room, the scent of eucalyptus, the calm that always seemed to hang there. When I reached the door, her assistant smiled and said she was free. Dr. Hayes looked up from her desk, her expression soft and knowing. "I wondered when you'd come back." I sat down. The same chair, the same soft hum of the wall clock. "I think I needed to understand what you meant by the prescription," I said. "At first, I thought it was about behavior or appearance. Now I think it's something deeper." She nodded slowly. "Tell me what's changed." I hesitated, then said, "It's like I'm living the same life, but with different eyes. I move differently. People respond differently. And I feel quieter inside." She smiled, not with pride but with understanding. That's what happens when the inner and outer stories start to match. It's not magic. It's congruence. I let the words settle between us. Congruence. A small, perfect weight. We talked for nearly an hour. I told her about the boutique, about the notebook, about the way strangers smiled now without reason. She listened, then said, "You've started to author your life instead of editing it for someone else." When I left her office, I walked slower, the afternoon light spilling across the sidewalk like liquid gold. I passed a group of college students laughing, and one of them accidentally bumped into me. "Sorry, ma'am," he said automatically, and hurried on. I stood there for a moment, startled. The word echoed, not in shock but in quiet recognition.
"Ma'am."
I didn't correct him. The city felt wider that evening. I stopped at a cafe I hadn't been to in months, ordered tea, and took a seat by the window. People drifted by in their own stories, and for once I didn't feel like I was watching from behind glass. I was part of the rhythm. When I pulled out my notebook, the pages fluttered like wings. I wrote, "Maybe this is what she prescribed all along, a way to meet the world without armor." As I sat there, an older woman at the next table leaned toward me. "I hope you don't mind me saying," she said with a kind smile, "you have the calmest presence. It's rare." I thanked her, unsure how to explain that it wasn't calm I'd found, but acceptance. Later that night, back in my apartment, I lit a single candle and turned off every other light. The room glowed softly, shadows breathing against the walls. I stood before the mirror again, not to check, not to compare, but simply to be. The reflection wasn't different in any measurable way, but I could finally see the story in the eyes, the hesitation, the small courage, the quiet joy. I whispered, "You made it this far. Keep going." And for the first time, the reflection whispered it back. I hadn't planned on becoming anyone's example. Yet change, once it begins, has a way of spilling quietly into the spaces around you. At work, the atmosphere felt lighter, not because the office itself had changed, but because I had stopped shrinking to fit inside it. My days flowed with small, unnoticed acts of bravery, speaking in meetings without rehearsing every word, smiling at people instead of avoiding their eyes, allowing silence to sit comfortably between sentences. One afternoon, Jordan lingered by my desk long after everyone else had gone. He was always easygoing, but that day his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." He hesitated, tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "You seem different lately. Calmer. Like you're actually comfortable in your own skin." "How did you do that?" The question startled me. For a moment I wanted to laugh, as if I could summarize months of unraveling and rebuilding into one neat answer. But his eyes were searching, honest. So I said, "I stopped treating who I am as a project. I started listening instead." He nodded slowly, processing the words. "Listening to yourself?" "Yes," I said. "To the version of me I kept ignoring, because I thought I had to fit somewhere smaller." He didn't reply, but I saw something soften in his face. A small understanding that had nothing to do with gender or identity, and everything to do with honesty. The next morning when I arrived, there was a note on my desk. "Thanks for yesterday. You made me think." That single line felt like a quiet echo of Dr. Hayes's voice, proof that calm could be contagious. Later that week, I met Dr. Hayes again for coffee. We sat by the window of a little cafe, where sunlight pooled like honey over the table. She asked how things were, and I told her about the conversation with Jordan. She smiled. "That's how it begins. You live truthfully, and without trying, you give others permission to do the same." I looked out at the street, where people moved in their own small worlds, phones in hand, conversations overlapping, lives colliding. "It feels strange," I said quietly. "I used to think transformation meant becoming unrecognizable. But now it's more like I've returned to myself." Dr. Hayes nodded. "Most real change feels like remembering." Her words followed me home. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the buildings, I opened my notebook again. The pages were almost full now, each one a snapshot of a season of selfhood. I wrote, "I think I finally understand what she prescribed. Womanhood wasn't about appearance, it was about permission. The courage to be soft in a world that rewards hardness. The grace to listen instead of perform." Not long after, a coworker suggested starting a lunchtime discussion group about confidence and authenticity. "You should lead it," Jordan said. I almost declined, but something inside whispered, "Say yes." So I did. The first meeting was small, just 5 of us in a quiet conference room, but when I began speaking, the fear melted away. I talked about the doctor who had prescribed perspective instead of pills, about learning to hear myself again. The room listened, silent and attentive. One woman's eyes glistened, another nodded as though she recognized every word. When it ended, someone said softly, "Thank you. That's what I needed to hear." Walking home afterward, I realized the journey that had begun as a private unraveling had become something shared. My reflection in a shop window caught the last light of day, and for the first time, I didn't just see myself. I saw continuity, a line connecting who I'd been to who I was still becoming. I whispered to the glass, "You're doing all right." And the city, with all its noise and movement, seemed to nod back. The days started to blend differently, no longer a series of ticking clocks and coffee breaks, but a rhythm I could almost shape with my own heartbeat. I woke early, letting sunlight stretch across the apartment, and for the first time I felt like I belonged in the hours themselves, not just passing through them. At work, things shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. I moved with intent, not arrogance, just the quiet assurance of someone who has met their own reflection and recognized it. Colleagues began to respond differently, not because I demanded attention, but because I wasn't avoiding it anymore. Small gestures mattered. A nod at a passing coworker, a smile that lingered for a moment, the way I leaned into conversation instead of shrinking away. Jordan noticed it first, of course. "You're different," he said one afternoon, his voice curious but not probing. "I can't describe it. You're lighter somehow." I smiled and nodded. "I'm learning to let go of the weight I've carried all these years." That evening, I walked past the same boutique I had once only admired from the window. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside and allowed myself to linger among the soft fabrics, the light pastels, the delicate textures. I wasn't shopping to change. I was shopping to acknowledge a truth I'd only just begun to admit to myself. Comfort could be courage. Back home, I pulled out my notebook again. The pages were full, but I added a new section, goals, not for work or performance, but for self-realization. Small things. Walk in the park without distractions, reach out to old friends, experiment with colors and textures that felt authentic. Each entry felt like a promise, but not a burden. Dr. Hayes called later that week. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "I feel capable," I said. "Like I'm finally seeing a path instead of just moving through space." She laughed softly. "That's exactly what I hoped for. Womanhood, or any kind of selfhood, isn't about arrival. It's about permission. The permission to inhabit the life that belongs to you." Her words echoed long after the call ended. That night, as I gazed into the mirror, I didn't see a reflection of who I was trying to be. I saw the continuity of who I had always been, layered with new understanding, patience, and grace. I traced my fingers over the glass, whispering to the reflection, "We're ready for what's next." The next day, I accepted the invitation to lead another small discussion group at work, this one focused on authenticity in communication. Standing before the group, I realized I didn't need to script my words. I didn't need to perform. The narrative I had been living privately for months now existed publicly, shared quietly but genuinely. Their nods, their soft questions, their attentive eyes became another mirror, reflecting a part of myself I had once been too afraid to acknowledge. Walking home afterward, I stopped at a small park bench and let the city move around me. Children laughed in the distance. The wind tugged gently at the branches above, and for the first time, I felt entirely at peace with the pace of my own transformation. It wasn't about change for others to see. It was about listening, observing, and embracing the subtle shifts that revealed the real me. I opened my notebook one last time that evening and wrote, "The journey isn't about perfection. It's about presence. About showing up fully, quietly, without apology. And that is enough." The city had changed, or maybe I had. Every morning, as I stepped out of my apartment, sunlight cutting across the streets and bouncing off windows, I felt a quiet certainty settle into my chest. It wasn't confidence in the loud, brash sense. No, it was steadiness, a knowing that the life I had begun to inhabit was the life I was meant to meet. At work, the small discussion groups had grown. People from different teams, different floors, even new interns began to attend. I didn't lead with a performance. I led with presence. I told small stories of self-discovery, the invisible threads of listening and observation, the simple permission to recognize one's own reflection without fear. And slowly others started to share, too. Their words weren't dramatic, but they were real. Someone spoke of hesitation before a career choice. Another admitted to hiding parts of themselves from family. And in hearing them, I realized how far I had come from the person who once avoided mirrors and avoided notice. Even outside work, life felt layered differently. The clothes I wore, the way I carried myself, the subtle choices in posture and gesture, they weren't about signaling identity, not anymore. They were about feeling fully inhabitable in my own skin. Walking down the street, I no longer flinched from passing reflections. Instead, I welcomed them. Each one felt like a conversation, each echo in glass or puddle or polished car window a reminder that recognition could be mutual. One afternoon, I found myself in the bookstore near the cafe I had grown fond of. I wandered to the self-help and psychology section, not out of necessity, but out of curiosity. Books on mindfulness, authenticity, and personal growth filled the shelves, spines lined like quiet sentinels. I pulled one out, ran my fingers along the cover, and thought of Dr. Hayes. Everything she had prescribed wasn't written in these pages. It had been embedded in her quiet way of listening, her insistence that I meet myself fully. That evening, I returned to my apartment and looked at the mirror again. My reflection had grown familiar in a comforting way. I no longer searched for signs of change. Instead, I saw the calm I had cultivated and the continuity of myself within it. I whispered, "We're ready for more," and the reflection, always patient, seemed to nod. By the weekend, I began making larger plans. Small at first, joining a local art class I had always admired from afar, visiting a part of the city I had never dared explore, accepting invitations I would previously have declined. Every step, though external, felt like an extension of the internal harmony I had nurtured. And with each choice, the fear that had once clung so tightly seemed to loosen its grip. At work, my team noticed. People commented less on appearance, more on presence. One colleague said, "You have a way of making spaces feel calmer, safer." "It's unusual." I smiled, realizing this was the echo of the reflection I had finally allowed myself to meet, the quiet strength that comes not from assertion but from knowing who you are and moving through the world with steady awareness. As night fell, I returned to my apartment and opened my notebook. The pages were filled now with observations, reflections, lessons, and quiet victories. I wrote, "The world hasn't changed. I have. And because I have, every interaction, every choice, every reflection is richer. Life is no longer about hiding or performing. It is about inhabiting fully, gently, bravely." I closed the notebook, looked at the mirror one last time that evening, and saw not a person transformed, but a life aligning with itself. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a set of unknown hurdles. It felt like a path I could walk, step by step, with calm, awareness, and quiet joy. The morning sunlight spilled across the city like liquid warmth, and I stood by my window longer than usual, letting the light settle on my shoulders. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to check my reflection with questioning eyes. The reflection staring back at me was familiar now, not someone new, not someone borrowed, but me, in full, calm presence. I thought back to Dr. Hayes's first words, "You don't need more pills. You need to start listening to yourself." At the time, I had laughed, skeptical, anxious. But now I understood. Listening had been everything, the quiet pauses, the acceptance, the noticing of small truths. I had learned to meet myself halfway, to honor my own reflection, and in doing so, I had been met by the world differently too. At work, I no longer felt the weight of self-consciousness. My conversations were measured not by fear, but by authenticity. I smiled without rehearsing, nodded without hesitation, laughed without doubt. And in those spaces, I noticed the subtle but unmistakable impact on others. Colleagues began to speak more freely, share more openly, mirror the quiet confidence I had learned to carry. It wasn't vanity. It was influence rooted in honesty, in calm alignment with self. Outside the office, the city felt more vibrant. I took my walks with attention, noticing textures, scents, sounds, the way a stray leaf danced in the wind, the hum of traffic softened by distance, the chatter of children in the park. Every small detail felt more vivid, more alive, because I was no longer running from it. I had permission to be present. One evening, I found myself at the boutique again, not because I needed clothing, but because I wanted to linger in light and color. I ran my fingers along fabric that felt like whispered promises and caught a glimpse of my reflection in a polished mirror. I smiled, soft and unafraid, and whispered, "We've come far." The notebook beside my bed was full now, pages dense with observation, gratitude, and quiet victories. I added one last line. "The journey is not about arriving somewhere new. It is about inhabiting fully, noticing deeply, and embracing the self that has always been waiting." Dr. Hayes called that night, her voice calm and familiar. How are you feeling? I thought for a moment.
Whole.
Present. Ready. Good, she said, softly but firmly. Because that's what matters. Not perfection, not speed, but presence. The courage to exist fully. I hung up and sat by the window, letting the city breathe beneath me. The reflection in the glass was no longer a question but an answer. I saw patience, I saw courage, I saw softness intertwined with quiet strength. I saw the story of months written in small gestures and mindful awareness. And I realized fully that I had arrived, not at some final destination, but at a life aligned with its own rhythm. The mirror had never changed me. I had simply learned to meet it without fear, to see and accept the person who had been waiting all along. I whispered one last time to the reflection, not as a plea, but as a statement. We are here. We are enough. And this is only the beginning. The city outside glittered softly in evening light, alive and unchanged, and yet entirely new to me. And in that quiet harmony, I felt something I had never known before, the unshakable, tender certainty that I belonged, not somewhere else, not someone else, but fully, unmistakably, in myself.